Richard grew up in a family where there was a strong tradition of doing the right thing. His father was an iconic figure. He signed Sweetwater Clifton to the Knicks, breaking the color barrier.
His recollections alone of being around his father growing up would fill a dinner table conversation with great tales, meeting Jackie Robinson when he was a kid, seeing what his father went through for fielding the first black player in Knick history.
Joe was someone who, as a coach, never let race get in the way of doing the right thing. And there's no question that that had a huge impact on Richard himself.
When I was 14, I was at a basketball camp with 5 other white guys. One of the white guys was hurling the N-word at the black guy day in and day out till I challenged him, and this guy had knocked me out cold. Well, the black guy was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, and a lifelong friendship grew out of that.
Everything Richard has fought for has not been popular at the time. And he has been this courageous light that has said, this needs to be said, this needs to be heard, and I'm going to say it.
Richard had very bravely spoken out against apartheid. There were risks involved. There were just a lot of bigots who didn't like what he had to say.
He was attacked for standing up and wanting to right a wrong. And to be brutally attacked as he was, to have the N-word carved with scissors into his stomach, he had to have been frightened beyond words. And a lesser person would have said, okay, that's it, I'm done. Not Rich. They who did that, it's the wrong person.
You know, he's really been in the forefront in the whole bridge between sports and using that to achieve equality, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
I automatically smile when I think of Richard. Wow. I smile and also a tear comes to my eyes. Whew. He's a good man. I thank him. I'm appreciative of the work that he has done. Thank you. Thank you, Richard Lapchick. Thank you for being you, and thank you for wanting this world to be a better place, and because of you, it is.
I have the privilege to introduce to all of you one of my personal heroes, Richard Lapchick. There are many reasons he's a hero for me, and you know, I first heard the name Richard Lapchick when I was a little girl, and I had the privilege to be seated in a huge arena cheering on my New York Knicks and watching Richard's dad coach them. But it wasn't until about almost 25 years later that I got the privilege to meet Richard sitting across the table in the office of one of our mutual friends, Lenny Zakem. Lenny was a remarkable man. He has since passed away, but both Richard and I had the same love for Lenny. And Lenny brought us together and challenged us to create a program that we could roll out across the country that would empower athletes, that would have athletes stand up to bigotry, prejudice, discrimination on the field, on the court, in the pool, anywhere sports was played, and then to use the power of the podium given to athletes to stand up across the community. And we did that. The thing that makes Richard a hero for me is the way he is as a friend. Richard is a true friend. When he loves from somewhere deep in his soul, to his fingertips, to his toes. He encompasses you in all ways and lets you know that you matter to him and he's there for you. Richard is a doer. He's a man who sees what's not right and takes action. And there are so few people in the world that you can make that claim about. Richard, I'm really proud to be the one introducing you tonight. For those of you who have never heard Richard speak, buckle your seatbelt. You're about to have the experience of a lifetime. And for those of you who have, you know exactly what I'm saying. So please join me in welcoming Richard Lapchick.
Good morning. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Carol. You are two of my favorite people on the planet. Generation W is my favorite event of the year. I feel every year that I learn something, that I'm moved, that I'm inspired, and I'm just so thrilled to have been asked to open up the conference this particular year. Some of you might be asking, why is this 75-year-old white guy here leading off Generation W 2020? And I hope I can give some of those answers during the course of the presentation. My Twitter bio might be able to start us off. It says husband, dad, activist, anti-racist, feminist, abolitionist, vegan, animal lover. Those are some of the values that I share with my family and hopefully share with the people I work with. I've been asked today to talk about some uncomfortable truths. George Floyd had us talk about racism and the racial reckoning that we are underway today since the murder. The Me Too movement had us confront sexism and misogyny. The Washington football team restarted conversations about how America started off with genocide against its indigenous people. We have talked about homophobia as a result of the Pulse nightclub shooting several years ago here in Orlando. And of course, we talk about violence in America all the time. Recently, we talked about 12 children being killed in Chicago under the age of 16. It isn't about 12 children in Chicago. Every single day in the United States, 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun wound. We are a violent society that we have to confront that truth in a major way. I'm from the world of sport. It's a new world of sport. With the pandemic and with the racial reckoning, it's completely changed how we've played sport. First of all, we saw the power of sport. As America was bumbling along, not handling the pandemic at all, Adam Silver shut down the NBA after one player tested positively, and the rest of America began to shut down. Literally the next day after Adam Silver made that announcement, Zion Williamson, yet to play in an NBA game, a new rookie, donated $1 million to help support the workers in the arena that the Pelicans weren't going to play in this year because of the virus. Literally every single player in the NBA, coach, teams came together and donated more than $100 million to help workers who were put out of work at their arenas, as well as to fight against the coronavirus. We missed sport. We had that in our gut that suddenly we weren't able to watch the teams that we love, and we had a void in our lives. And then as it started to resume, we had the murders of George Floyd and other people. It seemed like we have a police shooting every week since that time. The issue of police brutality, there were only 27 days in 2019 when a policeman did not kill somebody in the United States. More than 55% of those shootings were of people of color, in spite of the fact that they're being nowhere near that percentage in the general population. But this isn't just about police brutality and the racial reckoning. It's about systemic racism, and that we have to face and confront all the forms of racism, and also sexism, homophobia with the LGBT community, religious groups discrimination, as well as the way we discuss immigrants in our country. But I want to start on a personal note. You saw in the video about my background that when I was a young person, I've had experiences with my dad. Literally, when I was 5 years old, I looked outside my bedroom window and saw his image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, my dad not knowing I was listening, and it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. I didn't know what it meant as a 5, 6, and 7-year-old. It would only be later that I would find out the reason so many people hated my father at this moment. It was because as the coach of the New York Knicks, he had signed the first African-American player in the history of the NBA at a time that there were many Americans who didn't want that league integrated. The league's now 80% players of color, but in 1950, too many people weren't ready for that. My dad knew that I was a Brooklyn Dodger fan. Our whole family was. My dad had pitched in the Dodgers organization before he joined the original Celtics in the 1920s. And he was going to be the co-keynote speaker at a fundraising event at Madison Square Garden with Jackie Robinson. He said, "Do you want to come meet Jackie Robinson?" I said, "Of course." I didn't know who Jackie Robinson was in terms of his social significance, but he was a star of the team that I rooted for. So I was thrilled to spend a few minutes with Jackie that day. After the event was over, Jackie went home to be with his wife, Rachel. So Jackie went home to be with her. My father, who had a reputation for courting the New York media, took everybody to Mama Leone's restaurant where we went into the bar. And the most famous writer in New York City, and probably the nation at the time, addressed his colleagues, who of course were all white men at that time, and said, "Did you see that end showboating?" My dad grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, and he said, "Some people only know how to hate." I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I knew there was something terribly wrong in the country I was being raised in. So my dad is a double inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Everybody told me I was going to be an NBA player. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade and was one of the biggest players in New York City. I was being recruited by Power Memorial High School, which was the top program in the country. I didn't go there, but as you saw in the video, I went to a camp that coach had the next year, and there were 5 of his white players at the camp as well as a black player. And as you saw in the video, I challenged one of the white players who was dropping the N-word on the black guy for the first 3 days, and he knocked me out cold. You saw in the video who that black man was, then Lou Alcindor, now Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. What was important about the friendship that has endured all these years and become richer and richer was that as a 15-year-old white kid from a largely white community called Yonkers, New York, I suddenly had a young, urban, African-American lens to look at what racism was doing in communities of color. And I decided at that time that I was going to spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. I didn't know what it meant as a 15-year-old, but I knew that's what I was going to do. I ended up going and getting a PhD in international race relations and did my doctoral dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response to it. And I compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 1930s. The dissertation was published as a book. I was asked to start speaking about apartheid. In the mid-1970s, I founded the sports boycott of South Africa and the United States. The global community, if you don't know much about apartheid, came together for the only time in peacetime history to try to strangle a regime because it was the most racist system of government on the face of the earth in the second half of the 20th century. If you were a person of color, and 81% of the population were people of color in South Africa, you couldn't own land, you couldn't vote, you couldn't get the education you wanted. You were there to serve a very wealthy white economy. So there was a trade boycott, a bank loan boycott, and a sports boycott. You could get around those other boycotts, but sports couldn't be played in the dark, and it became South Africa's Achilles heel. The first team that was coming to the United States was 1978. It was a Davis Cup team playing in Nashville, Tennessee, in the North American zone of the Davis Cup. They were in the North American zone because the European countries would no longer compete against South Africa because of apartheid. So my role as the head of the coalition of groups that had come together to fight against apartheid was to go to Nashville and get those matches canceled. I was working closely with the African governments who asked me to announce they would boycott the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games if this team was allowed to come. So I made that announcement before the final speech that day, which was going to be at Vanderbilt University. And Dick Schaap, who was covering for NBC Nightly News, you saw his son Jeremy in the video. Dick Schaap came up to me and said that the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd. It was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia that night, I thought maybe for the first time in my life, I'd done something worthwhile. The next night, as you saw in the video, I was working late in my college office. The office was in the school's library. The library closed at 10:30. At 10:45, there was a knock on the door, and I assumed that it was going to be the campus security, but instead, when I opened the door, it was 2 men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, a concussion, and carve the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. I knew that night, laying in the hospital, that if people went to the length they did to try to stop my dad 28 years before, and to the length they did this night to try to stop me, that they must have thought that our using the sports platform to address issues of racial inequality and racism in this country was an effective way to do that. So I decided that night that I was going to spend the rest of my life using that sports platform to address racism and other social injustices that take place in the United States. That began my journey on the issue of race in sport. There have been women in my life who have played an incredibly important role. My sister, so I'm 75, my sister's 87. She was a civil rights activist in the 1950s before it was called the Civil Rights Movement. She moved to Africa in 1961, and I started reading about Africa, and that had a tremendous impact on me. My wife, Ann, is the love of my life, and for 34 years, whenever some sexist statement was made that I might have missed, she would point it out to me and make sure that I was on track, as has our 31-year-old daughter, Emily. Things are better for women, but they're still not right. In the last election, there was a lot of talk about the wage gap between white women and white men. White women earning 78 cents on the dollar of what a man earns for the same job. If you were an African-American woman, that was 64 cents on the dollar. If you were a Latina, that's 53 cents on the dollar. Women make up 51% of the American population, yet they only hold 19% of the seats in the House and 22% of the seats in the U.S. Senate. We rank 100th globally in the representation of women holding national office. We rank behind Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. Maybe that's why, in part, the U.S. is one of only 4 countries that does not mandate paid maternity leave. We are in the ranks of Swaziland, Lesotho, and Papua New Guinea. We rank 46th in the world in maternal mortality rates behind Saudi Arabia, Libya, Kuwait, and Kazakhstan. Only 4% of the Fortune 500 companies have a woman as the leader. Yet things are probably better for women in America than they are globally. One of the most influential books I ever read was called Half the Sky by Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl Wu Dunn. And it depicted the global oppression of women and also the heroic resistance of women in certain countries to fight that oppression. The statistic that stayed with me most is that more women and girls died simply because they were women and girls in the last 50 years of the 20th century than all of the soldiers who died in all of the wars of the 20th century combined. More women and girls were murdered in acts of gendercide in any 10 years in the 20th century than all of the people who died in acts of genocide in the entire 20th century combined. Every day I think of the 32 million girls around the globe who are school-age girls who won't go to school that day because it's either against the customs or the law of that land for a girl to get an education. It's why this wonder girl, now growing woman, Malala, earned the Nobel Peace Prize several years ago because she literally risked her life so girls in her village would be able to get an education. Women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44 are more likely to die or be maimed by acts of violence by a man than by cancer, malaria, war, and traffic accidents combined. 100,000 girls under the age of 12 are sold as child brides overseas. They'll never see their parents again. There are more than 100 million women and girls globally who have experienced female genital mutilation, which is a surgical procedure on the female genitalia for non-medical reasons. 100 million girls and women. I'm going to talk a little bit about human trafficking and the sex trade and how it affects girls and women globally in a minute. Former President Jimmy Carter, in his book, A Call to Action, called the abuse of women the largest single abuse of anybody in the world today. I'm not sure if it's the worst, but it's certainly up there with the worst. But there's so many more social justice issues that we need to deal with in this country for the sake of our children and for the sake of their children. When Barack Obama was elected as president, there were 600 hate groups in the United States. When he left office, there were 950. It's estimated today that there are 1,100 hate groups in the United States. White supremacist groups have grown by 100% in the Trump era. In the first month after the election in 2016, there were 1,200 hate incidents that took place in the United States, 12 times the number that in a normal month. Our children have learned how to hate each other. They're also waging war on one another. I mentioned the number of children who die of a handgun every day. 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun. 400,000 high school students, average in the last 5 years, have been taken to emergency rooms because of an act of violence that took place not late at night in some seedy location of the city, but on high school property during high school hours. The high school dropout rate in urban America is 40%. 4.5 million American women are battered, 900,000 are raped every year. 34% of girls will have a child before they reach the age of 20. And when researchers ask them, why did you risk completing your education? 1.3% will ever go to college, 3% will finish high school. Why did you risk a career that you might have had? The almost universal response that those girls give to the person asking the question is, because I wanted somebody to love me, because they didn't feel loved. The Penn State football story several years ago with sex abuse of young boys exposed the issue of child abuse in the United States in ways that it hasn't been before. But I hope we don't just remember the 12 victims of that Penn State program and the football coach who's now sitting in prison, but I hope we recognize that every day and there's a report of child abuse made every 10 seconds in the United States, and only 1 in 10 is reported. This is a huge problem in our country. Human trafficking, in the 240 years of the Atlantic slave trade, there were 24 million people enslaved in the United States, in Africa, and in Asia. It's estimated that today, as we sit together in this virtual room, listening to each other and learning from each other, It's estimated that between 28 and 32 million human slaves exist around the country, nearly 1 million in the United States. More than half are girls and women. Most of the girls brought into human trafficking are brought into sex trafficking. But it's the wealth gap that I want to address most seriously today, because the wealth gap is the root of all the systemic problems in this country, and it goes right back to the days of slavery. At the end of slavery, if you can possibly believe this, if you don't remember it from your history books, the slave owners were compensated for each slave that they lost. And those people who had been enslaved, who are now free, were promised that they would get land and a dollar settlement. They never got the land or the dollar settlement. Imagine if they held that land today, what that land would be worth and what the wealth that would be accumulated would have resulted in. So when I talk about the wealth gap today, the wealth gap in America between white people and black people is greater than it was between white South Africans and black South Africans during the height of apartheid. This was a regime that the global community came together to try to strangle. The Forbes list of the 100 wealthiest of Americans have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. Try to get an understanding of what I just said. 100 people in the United States have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. The wealth gap is the root systemic reason for racism. It affects education, it affects healthcare, it affects housing, it affects everything. Life expectancy for the bottom 10% of income earners in the United States is 14 years less than life expectancy for the top 10% of income earners in the United States. Black infants die at a rate that's more than twice that of white babies. We've all been reading during the COVID crisis of the disproportionate impact of COVID, both in terms of people who get the disease and people who die from the disease in black and brown and Native American communities. The United States has 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prison population. They're mostly black and brown. They mostly committed crimes that won't be on the books of state legislatures in the years ahead as we eliminate minor drug offenses from our laws in this country. So people will tell me when I talk about prison reform that, well, when they get out of jail, they'll be able to have a normal life. They're not eligible for food stamps. They're not eligible to vote. They're not eligible for public housing. And if they go to an employer and the employer says, have you ever committed a felony? And the answer is yes, that's usually going to be the end of the interview. These are some of the things that plague our country. And if this was a typical 30 minutes that I'm going to be with you, this is what would have happened in America. 70 children dropped out of school. 23 high school students were victimized by violence. 42 children were reported missing. 23 babies were born to a teenage mother. 1,800 children were abused. 258 women or girls were battered. 52 were raped. 57 were enslaved during the 30 minutes that we're sharing here this morning. I don't have any doubt that if there were more women and people of color in charge of our country, that we would be addressing these issues instead of the issues we do address as a nation, and we would be solving some of these problems much more rapidly. If you listen to people with diverse backgrounds, you're going to make better decisions. You're going to make good decisions and do the right thing. You're going to help children believe in what they can't see, and you're going to build a floor on the despair that too many live in and a roof over their dreams so that they can actually live out those dreams and be able to fulfill them. How do I feel about America today? Can we face the uncomfortable truths that I've mentioned? Raise your voice. Demonstrate if you're comfortable. Join that 26 million people who have been in the streets already if you're comfortable doing it. If you're not, or even if you are, volunteer. Pick an organization that has a social justice issue in mind that you feel strongly about. Read about that social justice issue, volunteer for them, and spend time with them, and you know you're going to feel good as a result. Donate money to organizations that are fighting against racism. Maybe most importantly, vote. The election this year is being called the most critical election in American history, and it's not just about the race for the presidency, although that is a critical issue. It's also about go out and vote for your sheriffs or police chiefs. If you're not happy with the way policing is done, vote for people who are more aligned with what you feel and what you think about. So you learned right at the beginning that I'm from the world of sport. Why do I continue to do what I do in the world of sport as opposed to somewhere else? For me, it's all about what I call the miracle of sport. Bill Curry, the former football coach and great player, told us this, that in the huddle, I can't think of any other place where this happens in our country except in the huddle. It doesn't matter if you're African American or white or Latino or Asian American or Native American or Arab American. It doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Sikh, Jew, Hindu, or Muslim. It doesn't matter if you're young or old, gay or straight, come from a rich family or a poor family. Your team isn't going to win if you don't pull together as a team. Imagine if we did that in corporate America, in faith-based America, in other parts of our institutions of higher education. I want to leave you with a couple of stories this morning. I was lucky enough to co-author the autobiography of Eddie Robinson with Coach Robinson. If you don't know who he was the winningest coach in the history of college football, coached for 57 years at Grambling State University and HBCU, sent more players to the NFL than any other coach in the history of college football, had a graduation rate of 80% in a sport where it hovered around 50%, never had a player get in trouble with the law, just an amazing human being. And I was asked to speak at his funeral in 2007. Speaking before me was Willie Davis, one of his former players. We were in the Grambling State Convocation Center. There were more than 10,000 people inside and another 2,000 outside. Willie Davis paused for a second and said, "I'd like all of Coach Robinson's former players to stand up." 2,400 men stood up. Players from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s came to this place, which wasn't easy to get to. It was in deep rural Louisiana, to thank Coach Robinson one more time for whatever they felt he contributed to their life. It's made me think every day since then, when it's my turn, who's going to come? What will I have done that makes somebody want to come and thank me? And to ask audiences that I'm lucky enough to be with, like you virtually today, when it's your turn, who's going to come? What will you have done that's going to make them want to come and thank you that one more time? The other story is about Nelson Mandela. So as I said, I was lucky enough to be invited to his inauguration, and I also knew that I wanted to be there when he passed several years ago in 2013. So after his inauguration, he didn't go to any of the diplomatic parties that were being there to celebrate his life. Instead, he got in a helicopter and went back to Johannesburg from Pretoria to attend a Zambia-South African soccer match, and he asked me to sit in the box with him. So of course I did, and I said, "President Mandela, why did you come here instead of all those parties celebrating your presidency?" And he said, "I wanted my people to understand that I know that I became free sooner than I would have and president sooner than I would have because of the sacrifices our athletes made during this anti-apartheid movement." For me, it's the biggest power of sports story. It's emblematic of what I said earlier about Nelson Mandela, that if he could become president of that country, that anything and everything is possible. Many years ago, when I was first starting out in the area of diversity and inclusion, wasn't called that in 1970, I went to a training, and the trainer used an icebreaker and said, "I'd like everybody to write on a piece of paper what they'd like to see on their tombstone." And I wrote most of what I'm about to share with you. There have been a couple of editions since then, but most of these were what I wrote down. He didn't have to be Jewish to want to fight against anti-Semitism. He didn't have to be a person of color to want to fight against racism. He didn't have to be a woman to want to fight against sexism. He didn't have to be from the LGBT community to want to fight against homophobia. He didn't have to be Muslim to want to fight against Islamophobia. He didn't have to be poor to want to fight against poverty. He didn't have to have a mental or physical disability to fight for people who have a disability. He didn't have to be an immigrant or a refugee to want to fight against xenophobia. He understood that we're all cut from the same human fabric. If we all stand up for justice and don't block its path, and that's how I define a leader, somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. If we're all leaders here today, then if our children have learned how to hate each other, we can teach them how to love again. And if they're waging war on one another, we can give them the tools to make peace. Thank you so much for having me today. Good luck with the rest of the day. I know you're going to be inspired for the rest of the day by all the amazing speakers lined up for you today. God bless.
My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble. Good